Hello, and welcome to Lecture 1 for Topic 3. And in this lecture, we're going to be looking at the different ways you can define crime and the different categories of crime. Here's just a quick overview of what you're going to be learning about in the chapter in Topic 3. Um, in this lecture, we're going to be defining crime and looking at the categories of crime. The chapter also covers crime trends, the different tools that are used to measure crime, and then looking at crime patterns as it relates to regions of the country, time of years, the season that crimes take place, and the relationship between race, age, and gender and crime patterns. So let's get started on those two top points. Defining crime seems initially on the surface pretty simple. A crime is a behavior that is prohibited because it causes a lot of harm to society, and that we don't want other people in society to be harmed. And so we identify those harmful behaviors. You get in trouble, in great trouble sometimes, if you engage in them. But when you look at the way that acts or behaviors are defined as crimes, it's not always acts that are harmful that are categorized as crimes. And some acts or behaviors that are not very harmful are crimes. And it kind of makes you wonder, well, why are they crimes? Because the behaviors don't necessarily lead to great harm to the society. So when it comes to, here's two examples of types of acts that are crimes, but that you could argue that the harm from these acts is not very great. They're oftentimes sort of known as victimless crimes. And so we'll take the second one first, prostitution. A lot of people look at prostitution and they say, well, where's the harm? You have an individual who is able to sell sex because there's a market for it, and they are giving pleasure to somebody, and they are getting paid for their services, and paid a lot if their services are really good. On the flip side, if you're not able to get sex in a normal way, like by dating or those sorts of things, then your sexual desires can be satisfied. Where's the harm in that? Who's the victim there? You could sort of say the same thing with drug possession. You could say that, when an individual is consuming drugs, who are they really harming? I mean, I guess if you get in the car and you drive and you're intoxicated, then that's different. Driving while intoxicated leads to great harm. But if you're just sitting in your, house stoned and watching a bunch of Netflix, really, where's the harm in that? Maybe you're harming yourself, but you're an adult and you can make those sorts of decisions. And so when you think about crime as harmful behavior, these victimless crimes don't maybe seem that harmful, yet they are still considered crimes. On the flip side of that, you see some white collar practices that are not criminal, but maybe should be criminal based on the amount of harm that they caused. And what comes to mind are some of the mortgage selling practices that brought about the great economic collapse of 2008, that not just because of the mortgage selling practices, but in large part due to the mortgage selling practices, that the housing market got grossly overinflated in terms of its value. And when those stocks were traded, they ended up being worth no value, and they really had this profound impact on our economy, which led to a great recession. Many people lost their jobs, many businesses closed, much tax revenue was never raised due to that economic collapse. Yet those mortgage selling practices, those bundling of mortgages that didn't have any value, those are still legal practices. And so it's a good example of a type of behavior that's quite harmful, but even to this day is not criminalized. So it gets us thinking, how are crimes defined? Your textbook offers three different perspectives on what gets classified as criminal: the consensus perspective, the conflict perspective, and the interactionist perspective. And it's important because these perspectives are oftentimes reflected in the will of the voter and in lawmakers. And when lawmakers and voters embrace these perspectives, it gives us a better understanding of why certain behaviors are defined as criminal, even though they may not be harmful. The consensus view is probably the view that you're most familiar with. From this viewpoint, criminal law are rules set by state authorities that express the norms, values, and goals of the vast majority of people in the society. Furthermore, criminal law is social control, and so criminal law controls those behaviors that are most likely to harm society. From this perspective, the behaviors that are widely accepted as harmful are the behaviors that are criminalized. And so things such as nobody, there's not a lot of debate about whether or not like homicide, murder is harmful, right? Vast majority of people believe that that's harmful. Aggravated assault, even simple assault, harmful. A robbery, whether it's forcible or not, is harmful. Forcible rape, right? There's not a lot of debate that these are clearly the types of behaviors that are considered crime. Why? Because the vast majority of people in the society think that those behaviors are harmful. Another view that the textbook talks about is called the conflict view. From this perspective, criminal law is a reflection of class structure, and that those that have the most economic power are able to criminalize those behaviors that jeopardize their hold on power, whether that's through holding elected office and then having the power to define what is criminal law, or probably more likely that those with economic power will donate to people in office to encourage them to define some behaviors as criminal and other behaviors that benefit them economically as not criminal behavior. Here are some examples of the conflict view. So, for example, if a person steals from anybody, but usually when you're stealing, you're trying to steal from somebody who has wealth, right? When a person steals from the wealthy, they're severely punished, right? So, but corporations can use legal tax avoidance strategies and practices that deprive the public of tax revenue, which is greatly needed. And that practice is legal. So, for example, a friend of mine teaches business ethics, and he was telling me about the practices that corporations can legally relocate their corporate headquarters to a tax haven like Barbados or the Bahamas. And in being able to relocate their corporate headquarters, they are able to avoid taxes. And so it's a legal maneuver that they're able to do in order to avoid paying taxes. And if they're not paying taxes, then that's going to increase their profit line. That practice is completely legal. And from a conflict viewpoint, they would say, well, the reason that relocation of corporate headquarters in order to hide your tax responsibility or avoid your tax responsibility is legal is because those with power are lobbying to ensure that kind of practice is not viewed as criminal practice, even though it is harmful. You can also see the war on drugs as an example of the conflict view. From the conflict view, on the one hand, that the owners, right, the people who make all the money, that they need to keep the working class sober and productive, and so you do that by making illegal certain substances. Another way of looking at it too is that alcohol and tobacco are harmful but legal. Marijuana is no more harmful, perhaps it's less harmful, but it is illegal. And so why is that? Well, the thinking is that those with less economic power benefit from selling marijuana. And so that the wealthy don't want people that don't have wealth to get wealthy. And so they might make the selling of marijuana, crack down on it in order to keep certain components of the society from gaining wealth. So those are just two examples that sort of help illustrate the conflict view perspective. The last viewpoint that your textbook talks about is the interactionist view. From this viewpoint, criminal law is not a reflection of what the majority of people want, and criminal law is not a reflection of what the people with economic power want, but rather criminal law is a reflection of the values, opinions, and preferences of those in power. And that those in power impose their own values and moral code on the rest of the population. that your textbook talks about them as moral entrepreneurs. And so that what they think is immoral behavior, then those are the types of behaviors that are going to be classified as crimes, even if that so-called immoral behavior it actually is not harmful. And so criminal law is a reflection of the morals of those in powers, not a reflection of those things that are inherently evil or harmful. And a great example for this is prostitution versus sex work. And so from an interactionist point of view, prostitution is seen as immoral, that prostitutes um, destroy marriages, that they tempt men, that they, hurt women, and that they needed to be protected from being, swayed into prostitution. And so, since it is seen as like sort of morally reprehensible, the act of prostitution, that it's seen as illegal and because it's immoral. But other people have a very different view of so-called prostitution, and they see it as just like any other work that should be regulated like any other marketplace, right? From a sex worker's perspective, basically saying that if this practice isn't harmful, particularly if it's regulated, then it shouldn't be considered a crime, and it shouldn't be considered a crime just because you think it's immoral. So that's a good example of the interactionist viewpoint. Please take a look at the concept summary for this. I think that does a pretty good job of sort of comparing and contrasting the consensus view, the conflict view, and the interactionist view. This idea that the consensus view wants laws to apply to all citizens equally, but from the conflict view, that real crimes are not outlawed, the law is used to control the underclass, and that the interactionist view is that criminal labels are life transforming events, and that in some way that's a good thing because we don't want people engaging in immoral actions. But anyways, take a look at it. I think it's a helpful guide. So taking and thinking critically about these three viewpoints, which of the three do you think does the best job explaining how behaviors get defined as criminal in the United States? Do you think the consensus viewpoint does the best job of defining how we define criminal behavior, the conflict, or the interactionist? Keep that in mind as that might come up into play as we move towards our midterm exam. Okay, the last thing we're going to look at in this lecture is the different categories of crime. It's important to understand the different categories of crime, particularly as we move on to look at trends in crime, and also as we look at the way that the tools used to measure crime, because like the Uniform Crime Report and the National Crime Victimization Survey will also often report out their data according to certain crime categories. The violent crime, when you think about crime, probably violent crime is the type of crime that, or the category of crime that's most likely to come up in people's minds. It's the kinds of crime that people report are they're most worried about, and that even though there's been a significant decline in the past several decades in violent crime, that there is still this perception that violent crime, that people are likely to be a victim of violent crime, and that violent crime is still, increasing within our societies, even though that's not true. And we're going to take a look at that in our next lecture. So the Uniform Crime Report, that we'll take a look at in the next, in more detail in the next lecture, identifies violent crime as 4 offenses. And so murder or non-negligent manslaughter, and so that's the willful taking of somebody's life, whether it is intentional and like sort of planned with like murder, or non-negligent manslaughter is oftentimes known as voluntary manslaughter. It's sort of like you intend to take somebody's life, but it's that it was sort of a crime of passion. But regardless, those are considered violent crimes: forcible rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. Those are the 4 crimes that are identified as violent crimes in the Uniform Crime Report. Your textbook talks about the difference between expressive violent crime and instrumental violent crime. A lot of times we think about violent crime as being an expression of rage or anger, that people engage in violent crime, they kill somebody or they rape somebody, or they rob somebody because they're really, really angry and they're acting out in terms of their rage. And that can be the case sometimes. But it can also be instrumental. That is, that there is some sort of economic or social gain that could be had from engaging in a violent crime. In particular, something like robbery could be seen as obviously you're robbing somebody because you want to have an economic advancement. But even something like aggravated assault could be instrumental. If you feel like you're a member of a gang or a member of a group that places a premium on a social status of being violent and being aggressive and not being afraid, you might actually get a social gain by an instrumental gain from engaging in aggravated assault. And you can hire people to murder other people. So even murder, that it could be instrumental. The other kind of category of crime that your textbook talks about is property crime. And property crime is basically crime that doesn't do any overt harm to individuals. However, that while most people think a lot about violent crime, and they don't, that property crime doesn't get as much attention as violent crime. Violent property crime is much more prevalent in the United States. It's more common. And really, when you think about it, it's more costly as well. So the UCR defines property crime as burglary. Burglary is breaking into some sort of domicile, a house, a business, in order to steal things. Larceny and theft. Larceny is just another word for theft, so it's stealing things even though you're not like breaking and entering. Motor vehicle theft, arson, those are the property crimes that are identified in the Uniform Crime Report. Although there are other kinds of property crime that your textbook talks about, as well as violent crimes. So make sure you read about those. And last but not least, we have, or second to last but not least, we have public order crimes. Public order crimes are behaviors that are legal because they run up against morality. So it kind of fits in well with the interactionist viewpoint of crime. Oftentimes, victimless crimes like prostitution, but also public intoxication, loitering on the street corners, lewd conduct, gambling. All of those fall into the category of public order crimes. Economic crimes are nonviolent acts where the principal motive behind that act is economic gain. So, insider trading, cyber crimes, identity theft, tax evasion, all of those fall in the category of economic crimes. And then the last thing is that you should be familiar with the concept of the FBI Part 1 crimes from the Uniform Crime Report. That the Uniform Crime Report, as we're going to be learning about in a little bit, is a way to gauge the fluctuation of crime over time and look at the overall volume of crime and the rates of crime. And so the Uniform Crime Report identifies about 8 crimes, I think that's the number, as Part 1 crimes. And so they have, in the violent crime, they have murder and non-negligent homicide, forcible rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. Those are considered Part 1 crimes. And the property crimes of burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft, and arson are also Part 1 crimes. So as you're learning about the Uniform Crime Report, just keep the Part 1 crimes in mind, because these are the crimes in the category of crimes that oftentimes get the most focus when we're talking about trends in crime in the United States. Okay, thanks a lot. Talk to you again soon.